My brother called me from my parents' driveway to tell me he had just signed over the house, not his house, my parents' house, the house they had given him 3 years earlier, free and clear, no mortgage, no conditions, just a deed transfer at a kitchen table while I sat in an apartment 40 minutes away that I was paying for with money I had earned and saved and budgeted carefully for years. He called me from that driveway to tell me the house was gone, that he had borrowed against it and the loans had called and the equity was used up and the bank was moving forward and our parents had nowhere to go. Then he said, and this is the sentence I want you to hold on to, because it is the reason I am telling this story. He said, Mom and Dad were wondering if they could stay with you for a while. I sat with that for about 5 seconds, and then I said, let me think about it. I did not say yes, I did not say no, I said let me think about it, because I am a person who makes decisions after thinking about them, and what I needed to think about was not whether to help my parents, it was how to help them in a way that told the truth about what had happened and what it had cost and what it was going to take to move forward. Honestly, that thinking took me 2 weeks. What I decided in those 2 weeks changed everything for all 4 of us. My name is Kevin Aldridge. I am 38 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a 2-bedroom house I purchased 22 months ago with a down payment I saved over 6 years by working a job that required me to be excellent rather than connected, and maintaining a budget that required me to choose between what I wanted and what I needed consistently enough that I now understand the difference in a way I never would have without that practice. I am a financial analyst for a regional credit union. I understand amortization schedules the way some people understand sports statistics, automatically, instinctively, with an immediate sense of what the numbers are about to do before they do it. My brother does not share this fluency. My parents, to their significant misfortune, chose to believe that his confidence was equivalent to competence, and they paid for that belief in ways I am still watching play out. This is the story of how I became the son my parents had always underfunded, the brother my brother had always underestimated, and the only adult in my family who understood, from the beginning, what was actually happening. Welcome to the Revenge Diaries. If you are new here, subscribe and like this video right now. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been the one your family overlooked until they needed you? One sentence. I want to hear it. Now let me take you back. My brother's name is Devin. He is 42 years old. He has always been, in the specific and exhausting way of certain older siblings, the version of things our parents wanted to believe was possible. He was louder than me in the way that reads as confidence before you understand the difference between confidence and volume. He was better at the performance of ambition, the language of deals and opportunities and upcoming projects that sounds like something is happening even when nothing is. He had, by the time he was 35, accumulated 3 failed business ventures, 2 dissolved LLCs, 1 bankruptcy that my parents had helped him navigate without ever mentioning to me it was happening, and a reputation in our family's social circle as someone on the verge of something big that had been perpetually on the verge for 15 years. Our parents, Gerald and Marlene Aldridge, 64 and 62 years old at the time this story starts, had been funding the verge for most of those 15 years, not secretly, exactly, but not transparently either. It was the kind of financial support that was mentioned in pieces rather than totals, so that any individual item seemed reasonable and the accumulating pattern remained invisible unless you were keeping records. I was keeping records, not because I was suspicious, but because I am a financial analyst and keeping records is what I do with information the way other people keep receipts or take photographs. I wrote things down when they were mentioned, I did the math when the numbers came up, and the math, over 15 years, was alarming. The house transfer was the culmination of something that had been building for years. My parents had purchased the property in the late 90s, a 3-bedroom ranch in a suburb of Atlanta that had appreciated considerably in value over 2 decades when my father's health issues began and they were thinking about their next chapter. Devin had made a proposal. He said he would renovate the property, modernize it, add value, and that my parents could live with him there while they figured out their long-term plan. He said he needed the deed transferred to facilitate the renovation financing. He said it would all work out. My parents, who had been saying it will all work out with Devin for 15 years and who had developed an extraordinary tolerance for the gap between his projections and his results, agreed the deed was transferred. I found out about it 6 months after the fact, mentioned in passing during a Sunday phone call by my mother as something they had taken care of. She did not ask my opinion. She did not mention it as a decision under discussion. She mentioned it the way you mention something that has already been concluded when you are telling someone who was not part of the conclusion. I noted it. I said, I hope that goes well. I went back to my budget. The renovation did not happen in the way Devin had described it. What happened instead was that Devin, who had identified the transferred property as an asset he could borrow against, took out a home equity line of credit 6 months after receiving the deed. He used the funds, which my parents did not know about until they were already spent, to capitalize a new business venture. The venture involved a licensing agreement for a product distribution concept that his business partner had brought to him and that had, like most of Devin's ventures, the structure of plausibility without the substance of it. The business generated some revenue in the first 8 months. Then the licensing agreement encountered legal complications that Devin had not anticipated because he had not had an attorney review the agreement before signing it. The complications produced costs. The costs exceeded the revenue. The business failed. The HELOC payments stopped being made. The lender began foreclosure proceedings. And my parents, who had been living in the house as guests of their own deed transfer, found out that the home they had lived in for 23 years was being foreclosed on when a notice was posted on the front door. My father called me before Devin did. He called me at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, and his voice had the specific quality it gets when he is trying to remain calm around something that has made him very frightened. He said, "Kevin, there's been a situation with the house." I said, "Tell me." He told me, not everything. There were things he still did not know and things he knew but could not yet say, but enough. I listened without interrupting for 11 minutes. When he finished, I said, "Dad, are you and Mom safe?" He said yes. I said, "Okay, don't sign anything, don't talk to the lender without an attorney. I'll call you back this afternoon." I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and I did not panic. I opened my laptop. I pulled the public property records for the Atlanta address. I found the deed transfer, the HELOC filing, the foreclosure notice. All of it was in the public record, because in real property transactions, everything is in the public record if you know where to look. I spent 2 hours reading the documents, and then I started making calls. I want to stop here for a moment and ask you something honestly. When someone you love has made a mistake, or allowed a mistake to be made on their behalf, that has significant consequences for their life, what is your first instinct? To fix it for them? To tell them I told you so? To walk away? I have thought about this question more than almost any other question in the past 3 years, because the answer to it determined everything I did next. My first instinct was none of those 3 things. My first instinct was to understand the full picture before I made any decision, and to make sure that whatever help I offered was help that produced a different outcome rather than just a delayed version of the same one. If you are not subscribed to the Revenge Diaries yet, please do it now, because what I decided to do, and how I decided to do it, is the heart of this story. The first call I made was to a housing attorney in Atlanta named Carmen Brooks. I had her name from a colleague at the credit union who had used her for a property matter the previous year. Carmen was 53, had 24 years of experience in real estate and foreclosure law, and had the specific manner of someone who has seen every variation of a bad property decision and who approaches each new variation with professional equanimity rather than judgment. I told her the situation in the organized, document-referenced way of a financial analyst talking to an attorney. She listened. She asked 3 clarifying questions. She said, "The deed transfer was a gift to your brother?" I said yes. She said, "And your parents were not on the HELOC?" I said correct. The HELOC was in Devin's name only, secured by the property he owned. She said, "Then your parents' financial exposure is limited to the loss of the property itself. The HELOC debt is Devin's. The foreclosure affects the asset, not them personally." I said, "I understand that. What I need to understand is whether there are any options for the property at this stage." She said, "At this stage, there may be. Send me the documents." I sent them that afternoon. She called back the next morning. Carmen had reviewed the foreclosure timeline and identified something that, if I had not been keeping records, would have taken significantly longer to surface. The HELOC had been originated by a lender who had subsequently been acquired by a larger institution. The acquisition had created a servicing transfer, a change in who was managing the loan, and the servicing transfer documentation had a gap. A specific required notice to the borrower about the transfer of servicing rights had not been sent in the manner required by federal law. It was a procedural violation, not a substantive one. It did not change what Devin owed, but it created a basis for a legal challenge to the foreclosure timeline, and the challenge to the timeline created time. Not much time, but time enough, if used correctly, to explore alternatives. Carmen said, "Do you want to pursue this?" I said, "Yes, and while we're doing that, I want to understand what a short sale process would look like on this property if we get to that point," she said. "I'll prepare both analyses," I said. "Thank you." I called Devin that evening, not from anger, from necessity. He needed to know that I was involved and what I was doing, because any legal action involving the property required his cooperation as the title holder. He answered on the third ring with the specific voice he uses when he knows a difficult conversation is coming and is trying to get ahead of it. He said, "Kevin, I know what you're going to say." I said, "I'm not going to say anything you expect. Carmen Brooks is going to send you some documents tomorrow. You need to sign them and send them back." He said, "Who's Carmen Brooks?" I said, "Your attorney, at least temporarily." He said, "I can't afford an attorney." I said, "I know, I'm covering her fees for now. Sign the documents." Silence. He said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Because Mom and Dad don't have anywhere to go if this doesn't get handled right." Sign the documents, Devin. He said, "Kevin," I said, "sign them," and I ended the call. Carmen's challenge to the foreclosure timeline bought us 63 days during which I worked with a short sale specialist Carmen referred me to, and during which I had 3 conversations with my parents that were among the hardest and most necessary conversations of my adult life. The first conversation established what they actually knew and did not know about what Devin had done with the property. The second conversation established what their financial situation looked like independent of the house, their social security, my father's pension, their savings, their debts. The third conversation established what I was willing to do and on what terms. That third conversation was the one I had spent the 2 weeks after Devin's phone call preparing for, because that conversation required me to say things I had never said directly to my parents in 38 years, and saying them was the most important thing I did in this entire situation. I drove to Atlanta on a Saturday morning. I arrived at 11. My parents were at the kitchen table, which is where my parents have always had serious conversations because the kitchen table is in our family, the place where things that matter get said. I sat down. I had a folder, not dramatic, just organized bank statements I had requested from my parents, the property documents Carmen had shared, a budget worksheet I had prepared for my parents' income and expenses independent of the house. I placed the folder on the table and I said, "I want to go through some things with you, and then I want to tell you what I'm willing to do and what I need in return." My mother said, "In return?" She said it the way a person says something that surprises them slightly, not offended, just unused to the framing. I said, "Yes, Mom, in return, because we need to do this differently than we have been doing things as a family." My father looked at the folder. He said, "Okay, Kevin," and we began. I showed them the full picture over about 90 minutes, not to shame them, to ensure that everyone at the table was working from the same factual foundation rather than different pieces of the same incomplete picture. I showed them the HELOC amount and the foreclosure timeline. I showed them the procedural challenge and the 63 days. I showed them the budget worksheet, their actual monthly income from Social Security and pension, their actual monthly expenses, the gap between them that existed with or without the house. I showed them what a short sale of the property might produce and what it would mean for their options afterward, and then I said, "Here is what I am willing to do. I will pay for Carmen's legal services through this process. I will work with the short sale specialist to get the best possible outcome on the property, and I will create a situation where you have a stable place to live. Here is what I need in return." My mother had her hands folded on the table. My father Was very still in the way he gets when something is serious. I said, I need you to be honest with me going forward about everything financial, not after the fact, before, and I need Devin to take responsibility for what happened here, formally, in writing, with Carmen's help, so that there is a record of who made what decisions and why, my mother said. Formally, I said, yes. She said, is that really necessary? I looked at her for a moment. I said, Mom, you gave Devin the house I grew up in, without telling me, and it is now in foreclosure because he borrowed against it for a business he did not have reviewed by an attorney. Yes, it is necessary. The short sale closed 41 days into Carmen's 63-day window. The property sold for less than its pre-HELOC value but enough to satisfy the loan balance and leave my parents with a small remaining amount that Carmen had negotiated as part of the settlement terms. It was not what the house would have been worth if none of this had happened. It was what the house was worth now, after what had happened. Handled as well as it could be handled in the circumstances that existed, Carmen said it was one of the cleaner short sale resolutions she had managed given the timeline constraints. I filed that compliment in the folder of things that felt simultaneously good and unnecessary to feel good about. Devin signed the formal acknowledgement of responsibility that Carmen prepared. It was not a legal admission in the criminal sense. There was no criminal conduct to admit. It was a documented statement of the facts that he had received a property transfer from his parents, that he had borrowed against the property without disclosing this to his parents, that the resulting foreclosure had caused them to lose the home, and that he acknowledged these facts in their consequences. He signed it in Carmen's office in Atlanta on a Wednesday afternoon. I was not in the room. Carmen sent me the signed document by email. I read it once. I filed it. I did not feel satisfaction about it exactly. I felt the specific, functional relief of a process having been completed correctly. Have you ever been in a position where you had to be the adult in your family, not because you were the oldest or the most experienced, but simply because you were the one willing to do it? I want to hear from you in the comments, because that position, the one where you are doing the necessary thing that no one else is doing, is one of the loneliest and most clarifying positions available in adult life. Drop your story below. My parents moved in with me in Charlotte for 6 months. I want to tell you about those 6 months honestly, because they were not the version of this story that involves healing and redemption arriving quickly. They were 6 months of adjustment and difficulty and the specific friction of 3 adults with different habits and histories, and unresolved emotional material learning to share a 2-bedroom house. My father was grateful in the consistent, quiet way of a man who knows he has needed help he did not expect to need. My mother was grateful too, but in a way that periodically expressed itself as commentary on my kitchen organization, my grocery choices, and the temperature I kept the thermostat at, which is a form of love I recognize and which I navigated with more patience than I had expected to possess. We had good evenings and difficult mornings and Sunday breakfasts that were, by the 4th month, something I looked forward to in the way you look forward to things that are becoming real, rather than performed. Devin visited twice during those 6 months. The first visit was awkward in the specific way of a person who knows that the room he is entering has a full understanding of the situation he created. He was quieter than I had ever seen him. He did not talk about upcoming projects or opportunities in the offing. He sat at my kitchen table and ate the dinner my mother had made and talked about his job. He had taken a full-time position with a supply chain company, actual employment with a salary in the WI. For the first time in approximately a decade, I asked him questions about it with genuine interest, not performance interest, because the version of Devin who had a WI and was paying his own expenses was a version I was genuinely rooting for, and I found, to my own surprise, that the rooting was real. The second visit, 3 months later, was different. He arrived earlier than expected and found me at the kitchen table with my laptop, reviewing the financials for a rental property I had been evaluating as a possible purchase. He sat down without being asked. He looked at the screen. He said, "What are you looking at?" I told him. He asked questions, good questions, specific ones, about cap rate and cash-on-cash return and the management cost structure. I answered them. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours going through the numbers together. It was the first real conversation we had had in years that was not about a problem or a crisis or something requiring resolution. It was just two people talking about money and how it works, and one of them had more fluency than the other and was sharing it without being asked. When he left that evening, he stopped at the door and he said, "Kevin," I said. "Yeah," he said. "I'm sorry, not for anything specific, just that," I said. "I know." And he left, and I sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. My parents found an apartment in Charlotte 6 months after moving in with me, not because I asked them to leave, because they wanted their own space, and because my father's health had stabilized and my mother had made two friends in the complex near my house that she had started walking with in the mornings, and because the combination of stability and social connection had produced in both of them a version of readiness that I had hoped for but had not been certain would arrive. I helped them with the lease, I reviewed the terms, I set up their budget on a spreadsheet they could access on the tablet I got them for Christmas, I showed them how to use it, and I told them to call me before they signed anything financial ever again. My mother said, "You sound like a parent." I said, "Someone in this family has to." She laughed. It was the first real laugh I had heard from her in 8 months. I wrote the date in my records, not because I am sentimental, because I am a person who documents things. And that laugh was worth documenting. The formal acknowledgement of responsibility that Devin signed sits in a folder in my filing cabinet labeled Aldridge Family Property Matter. I do not look at it often. It exists not as a weapon or a comfort but as a record. The same way all my records exist, they are there if they are needed. They describe what happened clearly and accurately and without editorial embellishment. If you read them without knowing the people involved, you would understand the sequence of decisions and their consequences in the same way you understand a case study in a finance textbook. That clarity, the clarity of an accurate record, is the most useful thing I have produced. From this entire experience, that and the spreadsheet my parents now use, and the 2 hours at the kitchen table with Devin and the cap rate conversation, and the Sunday breakfasts that became real, and the walk my mother takes every morning with her to new friends near my house in Charlotte, those things also exist in the record, just not in the filing cabinet. I bought the rental property I was evaluating when Devin sat down at my kitchen table. It closed for months after that conversation. It generates a positive monthly cash flow after expenses that I reinvest into the property reserve fund. Devin helped me evaluate the management company options before I made my selection. He has not asked me for money since the situation was resolved. He has asked me questions about his own finances 12 times since then, and I have answered every one. He is building something, slowly, in the methodical and unglamorous way that actual financial stability is always built, not through a deal or an opportunity or a concept, but through consistent income and controlled expenses and the specific discipline of not borrowing against things you do not fully understand. I do not know if it will last. I know that it has lasted for 2 years, which is longer than any of his previous ventures, and that the data, at this point, is more encouraging than it has been before. I am a financial analyst. I follow the data. My parents, in the 2 years since moving into their Charlotte apartment, have not asked me for money. They have asked me for advice 6 times, which I have given each time with the same combination of honesty and care that I gave at the kitchen table in Atlanta on that Saturday morning. My father has joined a woodworking club that meets on Tuesday evenings. My mother volunteers at the school library 3 mornings a week and is, according to her own account, planning to expand to 4. They are, both of them, people who are doing better than they were 2 years ago in ways that have nothing to do with the house or the money or the foreclosure, and everything to do with having made the adjustment from a life organized around managing Devin's situation to a life organized around their own interests and connections and the particular pleasures of their own days. That adjustment did not come easily. It required them to grieve the version of their family they had imagined, which was a version in which the investment in Devin had paid off in the way they had always expected it would. It had not paid off, but the life that replaced it was more honest. And honesty, in my experience, is a more durable foundation than hope for an outcome that the data has consistently failed to support. Here is what I want you to take from this, not the specific details of the property or the legal strategy or the short sale timeline. Though those things are real, and if you are in a similar situation they are worth understanding, what I want you to take is something more fundamental: the people in your family who are overlooked. The ones who do not need rescue, who pay their own bills, who maintain their own stability without asking for recognition or resources, are not overlooked because they are less valuable, they are overlooked because they do not require management, and the families that organize their attention and resources around the members who require the most management are the families that consistently underinvest in the members who would produce the highest return on that investment. This is not a criticism of my parents, it is a description of a pattern that is extremely common and that produces predictable outcomes when the management-intensive member eventually encounters the consequence of a world that does not share the family's tolerance for his projections. The overlooked member is then the only person who has the skills to address those consequences, and addressing them is both an act of love and an opportunity to establish, clearly and permanently, what the honest version of family support looks like. I provided my parents with a stable place to land when they needed it. I did not provide it for free, in the sense that I attached conditions, honesty, documentation, Devon's formal acknowledgement, that made the support honest rather than just palliative. Those conditions were not punitive, they were functional, they were the difference between help that produces a different outcome and help that produces a better version of the same one. My parents have honored those conditions every day since Devon is honoring them in his way, which is imperfect and slow and real. The folder in my filing cabinet is full, the Sunday breakfasts are still happening, the rental property is cash flowing. The walk my mother takes every morning is, by her account, the best part of her day, and I am 38 years old in a house I own with a job I am good at and a family that is, for the first time in my adult life, operating in something closer to the truth than any version of itself I had previously known. That is, not nothing, in fact, in the full and specific accounting of what was available and what was produced. It is more than I had calculated was possible, and I work in financial analysis. I know how to calculate what is possible. This exceeded the model. If this story meant something to you today, if you recognized something in it, if it gave you language for something you had been feeling without the right words, please like this video and subscribe to the Revenge Diaries and share it with someone who is the overlooked one in their family and needs to hear that the overlooked one is the one who matters most when it counts. And before you go, one question, one word in the comments. In your family, are you the one who gives or the one who receives? One word. I'll be reading every single one. And next week on this channel, a story about a woman who discovered that her business partner had been billing clients under her name for work she had not done, and the single phone call that unraveled everything. I will see you there.